You know, that hymn is becoming one of my favorites. I love the language of it. For anybody that grew up in the Baptist church, remember the Baptist hymnal, that was number 329, and Amazing Grace was number 330, right? So 329 to me was always the song you had to get through so that you could sing Amazing Grace, because everybody knew and loved that song, and every worship leader would try to pair them together, because you could just flow from one to the other. So I think as I'm getting older and more understanding of the wording that is in that hymn, because it really is deep and theological, I love it, and it speaks to me, and I'm glad we got to sing that today. Listen, you need to be in Genesis chapter 4. We're going to look in verses 1 through 16. And the way this is going to work, and pretty much the way this is going to work for the rest of our summer, is we're just going to work through this a couple of verses at a time. If you come on Wednesday nights, the format of this is going to feel very similar, except I'm not going to ask questions and then stare at you to answer, okay? Like, it'll still be more of a one-way conversation like we're used to on Sunday mornings, but we are going to take it in chunks and just allow the narrative to play out. Because, like, for instance, even Cain and Abel, there's so many ways to address, or from my perspective, to preach the story. But what we are going to do for the summer is focus on the story and allow the story to speak, and then we'll pull truth out of it and allow the Lord to speak to us in that way. So in Genesis chapter 4, let's look at verses 1 through 2. We kind of get our introduction, or what I call the characters. All right? It says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of Yahweh, I have brought forth a man. And later she gave birth to his brother Abel. So we get the characters. This is the introduction. Adam and Eve have survived chapter 3, and it's important we remember the context, right? Chapters 1, everything's created. Chapter 2, second version of everything is created. Chapter 3, everything absolutely falls apart because Eve gets hungry, right? So that's terrible. And the world itself has fallen apart. And then chapter 4 is, all right, what's next? Like, what do you do after that? And especially for them, they've survived this catastrophic event that they should not have survived, but God was gracious and allowed them to survive it. So what do you do next? Well, they decide to have a baby, all right? And that works also. But the question then that sets up, and this is the flowing of the book of Genesis, and you want to see what this is, because ultimately this is the question we want to ask as we read the story, is how does the events of chapter 3, the fall, affect life on earth for Adam and for Eve, and then obviously then for the children that come from us? So will the events of the fall affect human life? And obviously we know the story, the answer will be terribly, all right? But that's what we're seeing. So that's our transition. We get our characters, we get our context, and then we move into the story of Cain and Abel. It starts with what I call the gift. It says, and kind of the end of verse 2, now Abel kept flocks. I should have read this earlier. Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. So Cain, the firstborn, was a farmer. Abel, the secondborn, he likes to play with animals and things. All right? Verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to Yahweh. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And Yahweh looked with favor on Abel and his offering. But on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. All right? Now, we know that this is going to go poorly for Cain, but just off the front, let's just give the man a little bit of credit. Who was the first to bring the offering? Cain was. Like, I love that. Like, here's the older brother showing us how to do it and then not quite getting it right. All right? So we'll give him his credit, and now we're going to watch his downfall. So God, these gifts are brought as an offering to God, and as far as we know, like, this is the first gift that's ever been done. This is the first offering that's ever been done to God, and yet somehow Cain and Abel are supposed to have an understanding of what that's supposed to look like. The story assumes that they know the right way to do it. And we don't know why, but there's a background of understanding that kind of comes from Adam and Eve and their relationship with God. But God sees the offerings and he accepts Abel's, but he doesn't accept Cain's. And the question is why? Now this is where we need to be careful and look at what the story says. Because immediately you're thinking in the back of your mind, right? Cain wasn't good enough. And obviously Abel's was. And there's some truth to that. But what does the story say? Like the Bible itself, what does it tell us? It says that they brought this, it says in verse 3, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. What do we see? Like, what do we know? What can we learn from that? Well, one is that they're both voluntary offerings. God didn't require it. There's not like a calendar or anything saying that you got to bring it. They just decide, Cain is the good big brother leading the way, right? We're going to bring an offering to God as an expression, I guess, of thanksgiving, at least as an act of worship. So they both bring voluntary offerings. And the difference is that Abel brought what it called the fat portions of the firstborn, all right? So basically, he killed the best of the calf. That would be the first one, right? The biggest. And then he took the best parts of it, like the ribeye or something, and brings that to the Lord. That's the part that he gives. Whereas Cain does what? He brings some. Now, I remember as a kid thinking, well, that just boils down to this, is that God doesn't like fruit. Like, it totally makes sense. God likes cows. And I actually think that to be true, right? That God is a meat eater, this whole vegan thing, whatever. But no. What we have to devise is if God then looks at both of their offerings and he shows favor to one and favor to the other, is it a fruit versus animal thing? I don't think so, because that just doesn't seem fair. Because that means all farmers are now, unable to give an offering that is pleasing to the God. And that just doesn't seem like the way God works. So it has to be something to do with Cain's first fruit, the fat portion. Abel's fat portion versus Cain's son. And of course that allows us to pull there's a truth here. And I don't want to overemphasize this because the text doesn't elaborate any further, but I do think there's truth here for us to recognize that Abel seems to have brought the best of what he had to give. And Cain didn't. Cain brought some apples and some oranges, and Abel brought the best that he had. And that raises this question, and I'm going to ask you, and you just think about it for a second. Does God deserve our best? The answer is yes. Of course he does. So we learn, even at the very beginning of the story, is that God deserves the best of what we have, and that we don't give God what's left over. Now think about how that plays out in your life. Like, for instance, all right, let's talk about money for 30 seconds and be awkward. Do you give the tithe? Do you give your tithe on the front end? Or do you look at the end of the month, I got $50 left, we'll give that to Jesus? No, I actually did that last month because I forgot. So this month I wrote 2 checks, and boy, it's hurt me, right? Because I called it up. I got it right, Charles. We're calling it now. But holy cow, my bank account's like, dude, where'd all that money go? Well, that's because I messed up last month and I had to fix it. Does God deserve the best? Yes. I don't give him from what's left over. I give him the best of what I have. The same thing with like energy and time. To me, that's even more important. Like that God deserves the best of my effort. And he deserves the first cut of my time. And often we look at it, and this is actually what I see this happening in our world, is we restructure calendars. Have y'all noticed that a lot of calendars now start on Monday instead of on Sunday? And that is actually a thoughtful process of change in culture, that Sunday is no longer the start of the week where we give God the beginning. It's now the tack on. And if you have any time or energy left, you can bother to get up. Yeah, I'll go to church, right? Or I'll do something that has to do with Jesus and the kingdom. It's a cultural shift that is happening, and it's present in a lot of us, where we still give God our time, we still give him our effort, but it's what's left at the end of the weekend saying, I'm going to start my week with worship and time with the Lord. I want you to think that God deserves the best of what we have. And yeah, money, sure, but to me what's more important is time and effort and energy. Knowing that who God is and the kingdom that he is building and the kingdom that he has called us to be a part of is the most important thing in our life. And it's just a casual reminder there that that's the way it is. So I think we can pull that from Abel, that Abel brings the best that he has, and yes, God deserves the best. And that's obviously what God then shows favor on, but look at how God does that. This is pretty significant. If you look at the end of verse 4 and into verse 5, it says that Yahweh looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Now ask yourself the question, what is it that God looks at? He looked at the offering, yes, but that's not the only thing he examined, is it? First it says he looked at the man, or the woman, but in the story it's the man, right? He looks at Abel and the offering that he brought. And he looks at Cain and the offering that he brought. God looks at the heart of the person, as well as the physical thing that was brought. So then we have to step back and think, why is God, showing favor of one or the other, or see it the way most of us see it? Why is God rejecting Cain's offering, but he's willing to accept Abel's? It has really nothing to do with fruit and vegetables versus animal, does it? And it may even have very little to do with bringing the very best versus the almost best, because how do you figure out which apple is best? It boils down to the heart of the man. Cain was not invested and giving God the best from his heart. God is able to see that, whereas Abel was. So God's rejection of Cain's offering is less about the gift and more about the integrity of the giver. And we're going to talk about that again in a minute. We're talking some more of that in a minute. I want you to see that up here. Because this speaks to motive. It speaks to reasoning and the thought behind what it is that we do. And this is actually fun because it goes back to something that we're doing on Wednesday nights in the story of David. We're working through 1 Samuel, and we should just hear something that comes from 1 Samuel 16. This is God's instruction to Samuel when Samuel goes to find the next king after Saul. He looks at all these beautiful, handsome, tall men, and God's like, it's none of them. It's that tiny little kid out in the shepherd's field, right? Look, David's the one, and he's like, are you sure? And God's like, yes. This is what God says to him in that moment. Yahweh says to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Talking about the older brother. Yahweh does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart. So does the gift matter? Yeah, it does. But the motive behind it is really the defining factor. The character of the person is what God looks at and cares about. And we actually see that play out all throughout the Old Testament. You start getting into the minor prophets and the major prophets in the end of the Old Testament, where people, all right, I got to go give this offering, and I'm going to cut my X ounces out and give that to God. And God starts to say, I don't care about your offerings. The smell that I smell is terrible. It's like it has no pleasance for me. What I care about is your heart. I care about where you are. Are you actually repentant of the sins that you're giving this offering for? God confirms that for us hundreds of years later and hundreds of pages later in the Old Testament. And it comes back to this truth that the person and the heart of the person is what God looks at. And God looks then at Cain and at Abel. And he judges Abel as being repentant, as being authentic. And there's something about Cain that wasn't. There's something about him that just, there was no character there. So ask yourself the motives of what you do, like even while you're here this morning, and recognizing that we have one purpose in life, to honor God with our life, with our offerings, but also mainly with our heart, with our motive, with our intentions. So they bring these offerings. God's going to show favor to one and not the other. And obviously it ends in the chapter in verse 5. Cain was very angry. And he was downcast. Now, I want you to try to humanize that phrase. Like if you were to describe yourself or your child this way, my child was very angry and their face was downcast. What's happening? Like it's a temper tantrum, right? Like somebody's putting a hole in the wall, something's going to get broken. Like that's what's happening. So like humanize that. Cain is not in a great place at this moment. He's not happy with what God has done. And God, as the loving, benevolent Father, then comes to him and says, dude, what's going on? That's 6 and 7. All right? So Yahweh says to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, and it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now there's actually a whole lot going on here, which is difficult. Let's take it a few pieces at a time. I think it starts with that God notices Cain's demeanor, right? Cain, it said in my version, says he was angry and downcast. The Revised English Bible says, why are you scowling? Right? Like God looks at him and he sees his demeanor and responds to it. And what we can say then is Cain's inner attitude and his issues are starting to show. The thing that God saw in his heart when he judged the offering that he brought is now not hidden behind his facade of righteousness. It's now coming out in his face in the way that he's acting. So God was right. God judged the heart correctly, and now Cain, like any bully when confronted, is letting it come out, and he's showing his anger and his scowlingness. So God confronts him, and he says to do two things. The first one, he says, do right? Which is fascinating. It's actually, there's a whole other conversation to be had about this, about the idea of righteousness. But he says in verse 7, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? God only accepts righteousness. Why? Because he's righteous. Because he is holy. So the expectation and the demand is of righteousness and holiness. Now hear that. You and I know that. You've heard, I've said that 100 times already in the last year, that God expects perfection. That is the standard that God lays in front of us. And we know that. And this is a great little reminder of it, but put it in context. This is on the heels of chapter 3. The introduction of sin into our life the beginning of what we know as original sin that these two boys have now been born with, and the possibility of righteousness and perfection is no longer there. If there was an opportunity at actual righteousness and perfection on our part, which I think is totally feasible to understand that from chapters 1 and 2, in chapter 3 that becomes unrealistic and impossible. And yet the standard that God has not changed. It's the same. So he tells Cain, hey, you do what's right, everything's going to be fine. The problem is you can't do what's right. So you're going to have some problems. So God confronts him and says, like he answers our question regarding God's rejection. Like Cain was obviously wrong. There was sin that was present in his heart. God's calling him out on it. And then he tells him this, actually, it seems like an impossible thing. He says, it desires, like this sin is crouching at your door and it desires to have you, but you must rule over. You must master it. Now, to me, that's an odd concept. Because ask yourself, can we rule over sin? Ultimately, the answer is no, right? Like confronted with sin 10 times, 9 out of 10 times, I may get it right. But that 10th time, I'm going to mess up. So sin, like, can it be completely conquered? Can we conquer it ourselves? The overwhelming answer that comes out of chapter 4 is no. Because that sin is a part of our DNA at this point, thanks to chapter 3. We can't conquer it. But mastering sin is a lot like mastering a dangerous tool. Like I did some work this past week, woodworking stuff. I had my little circular saw out. And even like an idiot, every now and then, I didn't even put it on the table. I'd hold it out in front of me, and do that. And you guys know, like, you're not supposed to do that. But I did it and I got away with it. All my fingers are still here. And that's what it boils down to. Like I have mastered that tool. Which means that I know how to use it in a way to accomplish what I'm trying to do, but without hurting myself or the people around me, right? So I have mastered it. I am the master of that tool. It does what I want to. But what happens if I mess up? What happens if I hold the wood the wrong way? Or like there's this, you end up with a missing finger, right? Like, it'll still bite me. Even though I've mastered it, it will still bite me. And to me, like, that's the best way of understanding sin, and I think what God is saying here. Can you conquer sin? No. We need Christ for that, and He's already setting up the arc of that story that points us to Jesus. But can I master it? Can I be able to live in a world where sin is present, even when sin is present here, without it absolutely devouring me? Yes. Yes, I can. Because God has given us conscience, He's given us ability, and He's showing us the way to do it. And that's what He's telling Cain. He tells Cain to rule over this sin so that it doesn't overcome him. Yes, it's going to be there. You were born with it. But it doesn't have to define you anymore. It doesn't have to dictate all the decisions. And I think this is a great warning, though, about how easy it is to sin when we leave the door open. Because essentially what this conversation here is that Cain, he's mad. He's scowling. And the anger itself is not the sin. Notice that the sin was the poor offering. The sin was the not giving the God the best. But that anger becomes an avenue to further sin. Because what was a tiny little sin, all right, I just didn't give it good enough. I came to church only twice a week, whatever. I don't care. But I've got this thing, and it wasn't quite good enough for Cain. And there was sin that was present there. But it wasn't dealt with. It wasn't repented of. It wasn't mastered. So it festered. And that worked through anger, and anger is often the avenue to terrible sin, and it leads us to something horrible. Cain allows that sin to bite him because he doesn't master it. So God gives Cain a chance, and I want you to see what that is. Verses 6 and 7, Cain's messed up, God comes to him, and He gives him a chance to put this sin behind him, to even put this anger behind him and to be able to move on. But Cain doesn't take the chance. Instead, he allows it to fester. And that moves to verse 8 and the murder. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. I love how simple that part of the story is. There's really nothing to it, right? No ambiguity, no circumstance. It's just straightforward. Hey, brother, come out here, and he kills him. Cain allowed his anger to kick open the door to sin, and he follows that door even to the point of killing his own brother. And this is a massive statement about the pervasiveness of sin. He went from not giving a good enough offering to being mad enough to then going and killing somebody and killing his own brother, right? Like that's a huge swing. And so I want you to see like that little festering of thing that happened in Cain, whatever it was, and I want to think it wasn't that big a deal. It was just right there, all of a sudden ballooned out because he didn't do anything with it. He allowed it to take over him and it grew. But also we see it in the larger picture of what happened coming out of chapter 3, that this murder is a direct relation to Adam's disobedience that we saw in Eve's disobedience in chapter 3. We went from disobeying a simple command, like, don't eat that tree. There's 1,000 trees in here. Don't eat from the one. And they're like, I kind of want the one. And by the next chapter, we're killing each other. The pervasiveness of sin. The absolute cancer that it is because they let it in what seemed like a really small and insignificant thing. Like, all right, I ate the wrong apple. Turns into, it opens the door. It is the beginning of this terrible thing that ends with one person murdering another. I think that's the reason the story is told. We talk about that a lot on Wednesdays, right? Like, why is the story here? All the stories could be recorded. Why is Cain and Abel recorded? I think that's why. It's to show us the danger of sin. It went from, I can eat the apple, it will kill me, to my son's going to kill my other son. And I'm going to end up losing both children in the process. That's terrible. It's absolutely destructive. We need to see that and be warned of. That's the first meaning behind this story, is to see how absolutely destructive sin is to our lives. But that's not all. Remember, we've been singing about something all day, so you know what's coming. It's the grace that God has for us. So think about this. We literally, God confronts Cain and says, hey dude, you got to get your act together. I can help you with that. Cain's like, no, I'm going to do it by myself. I'm fine. So he goes and he kills his brother. And God's like, okay, let's talk about this again. All right. So verse 9, God immediately comes back. Verse 9. And then Yahweh says to Cain, where's your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? You hear the smart aleck, right? Like, that's all that is. That is teenage smart aleck. Am I my brother's keeper? And God's like, well, as a matter of fact. All right. Verse 10, Yahweh says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now, you are under a curse and are driven from the ground, which opens its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hands. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crop for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. And Cain says to Yahweh, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence, and I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. But Yahweh said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then Yahweh put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from Yahweh's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now there's a whole other conversation to ask. Who is left to murder him, right? And that's a conversation for another day. And if you notice in verse 17, Cain has a wife and he's going to start having kids. That's a whole other conversation. Like, where did this woman come from? Just put that aside and you dwell about that at lunch. Let's come back to this story, all right? This story is the punishment that God enacts on Cain, all right? So, and I need you to see this. So Cain, all right, you're kicked out. That's a pretty big deal. Like, no one likes to be kicked out. No one likes to be removed from their family. But remember who Cain is. Abel likes to work with animals. What does Cain do? He's a farmer. He digs in the ground and makes things grow out of it, which is magic all in itself. But he's a farmer, and he's the son of a farmer. And God says, you, through your sinful act, have desecrated the ground that you bring life from with this blood, and it is now cursed. And you are cursed, and you are forbidden from working the ground again. And if you ever try, it's not going to happen. It will no longer yield its crop for you. It took his life away. Everything that Cain had known and every skill that he had, gone because of this sin. And then he's got to go and he lives in this land of Nod. He moves essentially to the city. It'd be like taking Brian and moving into New York City. Like, hey man, you got to make it work. All right? That's what this is. Like, so see that. I think we miss that sometimes because we read through the story, but okay, yeah, I know this, keep going. Remember that Cain is a farmer. It's the only life he's ever known. And God says, you will never do that again. And when you try, it will frustrate you because it will never work for you ever again. Cain doesn't just lose his brother. He doesn't just lose access to his family. He loses his livelihood. He loses his identity. Do you see what sin does to us? It costs everything. It ruins everything. It destroys everything that it touches. This isn't just God punishing Cain. It's showing us what sin does to us. And even on top of that, there's worse. Look at what happened. He said it in verse 14 when he complains back. Today you are driving me from the land. Yeah, that's terrible. And I will be hidden from your presence. Don't forget the fact that Cain gets to call God by name. All right? Well, I don't know what that looked like. I imagine that and have fun with it. But Cain gets to have direct conversations with God and calls him by name. Not anymore. You've been cut off. Your sin has separated you from me, God says. Isn't that exactly how we understand sin? That sin cuts us off from God. Not God cutting us off. We have cut ourselves off because we thought, I got this. And God's like, no, you're not perfect anymore, and I am perfect. The point is, sin is life-wrecking. It wrecks Cain's life. It wrecks his brother's life. It also wrecks his parents' life. Because remember, poor Adam and Eve, they've now lost 2 sons out of this. One was killed. The other is banished. We're answering the question we asked at the beginning is, what effect does chapter 3 have on human life? It's horrific. It's cataclysmic. It ruins everything. Just in the next chapter. So I need you to think about this and just pay attention to your sin. I told you, at some point today, you're probably a mirror's going to pop and you're going to remember something you did yesterday or even this morning, whatever. Something's going to pop into your mind. There's a sin that I have there and you're going to be reminded of it. And you need to be reminded of how ugly that is and how destructive it is in your life if you don't master it, if you don't repent of that and ask the Lord to handle that and take it from you. So our adultery, our racism, our lying, our inability to be truthful, our cheating, our abusing, they all seem like small. That's just what it means to be human. Well, it is. But all of those are the same as Cain's murder. And we see what that did to Cain as a template of warning of what it can do to you. We have to grasp the seriousness of our sin and how it will absolutely wreck our life if not handled by Yahweh and by Jesus. And also, this is from the human perspective. I cannot accept what comes next if I've not first accepted the graveness of my sin. I love having that conversation with children. They're like, hey, I want to get baptized. I want to follow Jesus. Well, the first thing you talk about is what? Do you understand what sin is? Do you realize that you're messed up and deserve to go to hell? That's a terrible conversation to have with an 8-year-old, but that's the conversation that has to happen because you cannot grasp the grace that God has for you through Jesus if you do not first grasp the fact that you desperately need it. So Cain helps us understand, man, I'm ruined. I am ruined because of my sin. But God has grace. How fantastic that God is graceful, even to Cain. There's actually a transition story that when you think about, God was gracious to Adam and Eve, right? They started all these things. There's punishment, there's exercise, whatever. They're kicked out of the garden. That's terrible. But then God allows them to start over and have a new life. He allows them to start having children. He provides grace to them. And then we see the same thing rehearsed again with Cain. Cain has done the unthinkable, and yet God is still gracious to him. He showed grace to him and allowed him to try again, to start over, even after his offering was a failure. God says, hey, we can fix this. Just do what I'm telling you to do. Everything's going to be fine. Cain chooses not to, and then goes and kills his brother. And God then is gracious to him on top of that. He marks him, and he spares his life from a blood avenger, which was a pretty big deal, right? You kill my brother, I'm obligated to kill you, right? That's the way it's supposed to be. That's not going to be true for Cain. God literally spares him and saves his life. Later, we can see it in verse 17. God allows him to have a family, have children. He founds a city in his son's honor. If you were to finish reading the chapter, he eventually founds a city and names it in honor of his son. That's a pretty cool thing. I'll never get to do that. Even in the face of the most terrible of sins, What is the constant? The grace of God. If God can be gracious to Adam and to Eve after starting all this nonsense, and if God can be gracious to Cain after murdering his own brother, God can be gracious to you. God will be gracious to you. This story is double hinged. It's got two parts. It starts with the destructive pervasiveness of sin. It is about that. We have to see chapter 4 in light of chapter 3 and recognize that sin ruins everything. It ruins lives. It's dangerous. It must be mastered. It must be put in its place. And we can do that thanks to Jesus. So it's about the pervasiveness and the destructiveness of sin, but ultimately it's about the overwhelming grace of God, who chooses in His infinite wisdom to love and to forgive and to give second chances. And here's what's fascinating. This is what it speaks to me. I think about Cain. Like, he's literally standing there in front of God. I'm sure his hands are stained with the blood from his brother, right? Because there's no orange stuff. He can't clean it off. It's there. He's got the blood on his hands when God comes and talks to him. Punishes him. And then offers grace to him. And that tells me, like, I don't have to clean myself up to come to the Lord. You don't have to clean yourself up to come to the Lord. Yes, you're thinking about that sin that you committed. I'm glad that you are. You need to recognize that needs to be mastered. But notice, you don't have to master that first. First, you come to God. And He provides grace. And His grace can cover even the most ugliness and most embarrassing of sin. So whatever it is, that image that's popping in your mind that you're absolutely embarrassed of, God says, my grace is good enough for that. I got it. You come to me and we'll take care of that second. So what I want to ask you and to chew on, like to kind of walk out of here with, is will you do, I guess, almost better than Cain did? Can you recognize the ugliness of your sin and be scared of how absolutely destructive it is for you and for your family? And allow that to push you to the acceptance of the grace that God has. Because God has, in His infinite grace, sent Jesus to cover over the multitude of sins. And they're all to be forgiven. They can all be covered over. And God can make us clean and righteous if we'll let Him. Let's pray. Father, this story speaks to us because it speaks to our brokenness, to our very humanity. Help us to recognize it, to be aware of how broken we are. We often get a big head and we think, I'm better, I'm good. No, we're not. We're just like Cain, in need of you. And allow that knowledge and the hurt and the pain that knowledge sometimes brings to push us to you in every place and in every moment, to come to you for grace, for forgiveness, for second chance, knowing that you are good, knowing that you are righteous, and knowing that there is always grace to be had in your presence. We thank you for that. We ask that you would help us to accept that grace in all things. We ask that you would do that in the name of Jesus.